Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Council of Juvenile Correctional Administrators Positive Youth Development Committee Education Webinar Series. My name is Mike Dempsey. I'm the Executive Director for CJCA. This is our sixth in a series of webinars this year focused on education and the juvenile justice system. Today's webinar focuses specifically on effective reentry practices. I want to thank you all for taking the time to participate in this webinar series and give a special thanks to Peter Forbes, Commissioner of Massachusetts Division of Youth Services, Phil Harris from Temple University, and Simone Gonsolin from the American Institute of Research, who all have put a great deal of work into the preparation of these webinars, as well as our presenters for today, who Peter will introduce shortly. For those of you who might be new to CJCA, we are a national nonprofit organization formed in 1994 to improve juvenile justice systems, local secure correctional and residential facilities, services, programs, and most importantly, the long-term outcomes for youth and their families. CJCA represents the youth juvenile justice system CEOs in all 50 states, Puerto Rico, and various other metropolitan counties across the country. At this point, I'd like to turn it over to Jonah, who is in the CJCA office, who's going to provide a few housekeeping directions. Jonah.
Thank you, Mike. A couple of quick housekeeping items before we get started here today. Everyone will be muted for this webinar, all attendees. However, you can ask questions at any time by typing them into your GoToWebinar control panel. Questions will be answered during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar, so please feel free to send your questions in at any time and we'll get to them later. The webinar is also being recorded. A link to the audio and video recording, as well as the PowerPoint presentation used today, will also be sent out to all attendees following the close of the webinar. And now I'll turn it over to Peter Forbes for some introductions before we get to our presenters. Peter?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. This is Peter Forbes from the Department of Youth Services in Massachusetts, chairing the Positive Youth Outcome Committee. I want to give a quick recognition to Phil Harris, who's he's on the Planning Committee. He's an emeritus professor of criminal justice at Temple University. He's been extremely helpful behind the scenes. He's also the person that originally promoted the idea of sponsoring the series. Simone Gonsolin, who's a principal researcher for Human Services and Public Health Programs for AIR, American Institutes for Research, and Michelle Phillips, who works here at the Department of Youth Services and has also been helping coordinate. I want to give CJCA and Mike Dempsey and his team at CJCA a shout out for sponsoring this series and for supporting the fact that education is one of the most important metrics that we have for success in juvenile justice. We're very fortunate today. Oh, before I do the introductions, the next webinar is Monday, August 6th, 4 o'clock Eastern Time. And in that webinar, we're going to be pursuing post-secondary strategies. Our two presenters today are on the cutting edge of reentry. So we're going to be talking about reentry, and we're going to be talking about educational reentry. Jacob Agus-Kleiman is with the Council of State Government, who has done a lot of work nationally on what the landscape looks like, and is going to contribute to today's presentation. I believe Jacob is going to go first. Kim Godfrey, who's at the Performance-Based Standards Project and has been for an extremely long time, has spent a lot of time trying to figure out what good reentry practice looks like and has been working very closely with OJJDP on a new set of reentry standards, and I'm sure Kim will be talking about that. So I want to thank Jacob and Kim for joining us, and we're going to go right to Jacob.
Great, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be speaking to you all, and look forward to hearing your questions after the presentation. Just to give a little bit of background, the Council of State Government Justice Center is a national nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that works with all three branches of government to support both criminal and juvenile justice systems, improving outcomes for both youth and adults who come into contact with their system. I work on our juvenile justice team, And across that work, we work with states and counties and local jurisdictions that receive federal grant funds. We also support, through the IO Youth Initiative, states that are working to reform their juvenile justice systems through legislation. And then we have a range of additional projects that we work on, such as the young adult learning community. We work with Latina youth mentorship grantees and a range of other projects. Through this work that we've had looking nationally, we've had the opportunity to sort of identify where states and jurisdictions maybe had similar issues or similar strengths or were impacting similar problems. And one of the things that we saw in 2015 was that many youth were facing educational challenges. Most youth had identified having a special education need, and significantly higher in youth who are in facilities than in the general population. More than half of youth who are incarcerated had reading and math skills significantly below their grade level. And the majority of incarcerated youth were suspended or expelled from school. And many have dropped out of school before becoming incarcerated. And as we know, becoming incarcerated does not help educational outcomes either. And so in most states, we saw that responsibility for, sorry, got out of order there for a second. In most states, responsibility for delivery of educational services really didn't rest with any single state agency, but instead with a combination of state, local, nonprofit, and private entities. And this combination of different providers made it hard to assess who was responsible, what the outcomes were, and even what was being offered to youth in facilities. So in 2015, in partnership with CJCA, we conducted a first-of-its-kind national study. That study went to all 50 states and received response from all 50 states and asked 3 primary questions. Those questions were: what services are provided, what outcomes are collected, what supports are provided for transitions, and then had findings, recommendations, and examples included in the report. And there were sort of 3 key main findings that we found through that survey. One was that most incarcerated youth do not have access to the same educational and CTE services as their peers in the community. That once they have come into contact with the juvenile justice system, they are not receiving the same services or the same level of quality of education as they would have seen in the community. Only 8 states actually provided access to the exact same educational and vocational services to youth who are held in their facilities as to youth who are in the community. At least 35 states had GED preparation, but if you look at the bottom part, when you see work-based learning or vocational certifications only being offered in 11 or 20 states, you see that there was a gap in terms of what was being offered on workforce development or alternatives to sort of educations, which is something that I'll follow up with a little bit later in the presentation. Additionally, less than half of states were participating in any sort of accountability system or national accreditation. So even when looking at the services that were being offered, it was unclear to what extent the outcomes of those services were being properly tracked, that service providers were being held accountable in terms of making sure that the services they were providing were evidence-based and meeting standards, and that the youth who were accessing these services were getting the information that they needed to be successful. The second key finding was that most states do not collect, track, or report student outcome data. So that goes back to the point above, where there was not necessarily an accreditation, and if there wasn't an accreditation, they still weren't checking to follow up to see if the education services being provided were successful. Most states were not evaluating really more than 1 or 2 measures, and very few were looking at anything beyond just attainment levels. They were not looking at performance once there was returning to the community. They were not looking at professional development. They were not looking at jobs, just really whether a GED may or may not have been attained. So while some states were able to track in their state-run facilities, less than 1 in 4 states were actually collecting in private facilities as well. So even as poor as the data collection might have been in terms of what was being collected, it's even worse for states that were using private facilities for a large percentage of their youth. And as we know, that's something that has increased in recent years. In many states, there are actually more youth held in private facilities than in state-run facilities. And so in looking at this data and seeing that they're not actually being tracked, outcomes weren't being looked at in the same way, it revealed a real gap in knowledge about what sort of services and what quality of services were being provided to a majority of youth who were being held in facilities and states. And the third key finding that we found was that the policies and practices employed in most states make it especially challenging for youth released from incarceration to make an effective transition to community-based services or educational or vocational services. And one of the things that we found was that in nearly half the states, there was actually no one who was primarily responsible for monitoring the transition successfully back into a community school or to a vocational workforce development program. And with no single oversight, no single responsibility, there really wasn't any accountability in making sure that the practices were effective. They weren't tracking whether youth were successfully transitioning back in. They didn't have a good sense of what was being provided to support those transition services, and it wasn't really a point of emphasis and was resulting in poor outcomes. And based off that report, we also identified that there was a few additional gaps, especially when looking at reentry and how it was affecting youth outcomes as they re-entered societies. So we decided that we wanted to look beyond just traditional education outcomes. So while the pieces of data that were being collected by many states may have been around GED or high school graduation rates, there was, in general, not looking at pieces beyond just traditional education. And if you remember, one of the earlier points is that many youth had already dropped out of school even prior to incarceration or been expelled. And that fact, coupled with the fact that the average age of youth in facilities is rising, and that as we said, more youth in facilities are not returning to community schools, that the current offerings in state facilities may not be meeting the needs of these youth in terms of successfully transitioning into society. We wanted to look at what is being offered specifically around workforce development and other alternative education options. In order to look at that, we are partnering again with CJCA to conduct a survey of all 50 states on 3 key areas really focused on CTE and workforce readiness programs. And that survey was actually just released 1.5 weeks ago now. It should have been sent to all 50 states. So if you are on this webinar and you've had a chance to see that survey and would like to ask me any questions, please do. But the survey focused on 3 key areas. It was the delivery and structure of CTE and workforce readiness services, what partnerships state agencies were utilizing to provide workforce development and CTE education, and finally, what sort of data was being tracked and quality assurance being looked at in order to ensure that what was being looked at was effective. One of the things that we asked in the survey, for example, is to what extent workforce local labor market trends are guiding workforce development services. In many states or facilities, you'll see what's offered is sort of just what happened to be available, who happened to say yes. And the certificates being provided may not match what jobs are actually available in the local community. And that's not effective. And so finding not just what's being offered, but what is guiding the decision-making for what's being offered to ensure that youth are actually gaining employment and gainful employment post-release. What we're hoping to learn from the survey is multifaceted. First is just what's available. In general, there's a lack of knowledge about just what is being offered in facilities nationwide. Secondly, is to look at who is able to participate in these services, whether it's just youth who already have GED or high school equivalencies, whether it's older youth who maybe have decided to transition away from traditional educational path, even if they do not have one of those equivalencies, whether males are offered this and females are offered the same services, or whether females are not offered the same educational services. And other factors just that guide the decision-making about who is able to access these services. The third piece we're looking at is what factors states use to determine which programs they're using in their secure facilities. So as I mentioned, looking at whether labor force information is used, whether they're working with local chambers of commerce to identify what skills they would like, local businesses would like to see, and other factors that would help increase the likelihood of a youth being able to gain employment, and whether those decisions and that information is in fact guiding what is being offered to youth in facilities. The next piece we were hoping to see is who states are partnering with to provide these services. Are they hiring and providing themselves staff that are accredited? Are they partnering with local community colleges, local community organizations such as Youth Build, who may be providing these services and facilities, and just trying to identify how those partnerships are selected and what quality assurance pieces are put in, which leads into our last piece, which is back to what outcome data and just quality assurance teacher tracking to ensure that these programs are effective and are actually meeting the needs of youth. Following the results of those surveys, we're going to be putting together another report like we did in 2015 that will provide findings, recommendations, and state examples of who's working well. We're going to partner with CTE experts and organizations and work with states and jurisdictions to develop model standards and guidelines for how to successfully implement these services in juvenile facilities to support reentry practices. The real whole purpose of what we're doing right now is to identify where the gaps are, because what we've seen when working nationally is that many youth who are more advanced or older are not having their needs met currently in the vast majority of states in order to successfully reenter. They're not having their workforce development or educational needs met. The services that are provided are not necessarily matching the needs in terms of employment. The certificates are not matching what the labor force requires. They're not matching the soft skills required. And just in general, that we're not seeing positive outcomes in terms of workforce development, job attainment, educational attainment. And as the evidence has continued to show, specifically around workforce attainment, that is a major barrier to successful reentry. It leads into housing struggles, it leads into relapse into behavior, it leads into just downtime where youth can go back to hanging out maybe with poor negative influences. And the successful reentry and the job is incredibly important, and it's not something that we're tracking or really have a lot of evidence about what works best. There are a few programs that have been shown to be effective working with at-risk youth population in general, but very few of those programs have really truly focused on youth who are juvenile justice involved. And those services need to be scaled up, they need to be implemented and put in place in order to effectively support reentry. So we're incredibly excited to see the results of the survey, to identify some best practices that are happening nationwide, and to get that report out into the field and to support what's happening and improve reentry services around workforce development and educational attainment. Thank you.
Well, hi, this is Kim Godfrey. Thanks, Angus. That was great. And thanks, Peter, Simone, Michelle, Phil, Mike, all of CJCA for this great series of webinar. And actually, the overall tremendous contribution the PYO committee is making to really help juvenile justice focus on positive outcomes. I was around a long time ago, as Peter said, as CJCA deputy director when they formed this committee, and was really wonderful. Phil Harris was part of it, Barry Studley, Vinnie Schiraldi, and Ned Locker, our past executive director. And it was the first time a group said what we need to do is flip this discussion about juvenile justice. It's really just whether or not kids fail, the whole recidivism conversation, but can we really look at what helps them move forward and to be healthy and contributing adults. It's also really interesting, I think, to reflect on how the approach to education and reentry has changed over the past decade. So I'm going to share what we have been doing for about 23 years. And first I'm going to explain who we are. As I mentioned, I'm the executive director of PBS, a program developed to address the dismal at best and dangerous at worst conditions in America's facilities as found out by the Conditions of Confinement Study of 1994. Congress mandated OJJDP, the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, to study all the facilities, and they selected a Cambridge, Massachusetts research firm, Apt Associates, to do the work. The findings showed high rates of pretty much everything bad: suicide, injuries, little available timely mental health or health services, lots of overcrowding, and lots of high rates of staff turnover. They also found that existing pass-fail checklist accreditations really didn't make a difference. As is still true today, a facility with accreditation could be terrible, and a wonderful facility doesn't need to be accredited. But what it did was it forced OJJDP to develop national standards that would hold facilities accountable with performance data. They wanted data to show that if the policies were being implemented as intended, or it's kind of as Angus was alluded to, are these services really meeting the needs of the kids, the staff, and the family? Did they make a difference? So the whole thing is to come up with information that truly reflects the quality of life and daily experiences in the facilities. It was a competitive process, and OJJDP selected CJCA. It was a 1-month-old organization at that moment, and as Mike said, it's the national organization of all the state agency directors. It was quite a quick start for us back then, and we were proud in 2004 to be a winner in the Innovations American Government Award, because what PBS figured out in its development was that if you can help find the right information and give it to folks doing the work, they will use the information to make some changes. We're awful grateful at the time in 2004, because that was when OJJDP was ready to stop funding PBS, and they helped us over about 3 years transition to a new independent organization that was solely charged with continuing the work at the end of federal funding. So since the beginning, our vision has been that all juvenile facilities operate as if the next child is one of our own. That came from our OJJDP project monitor, and it's really kept us, I think, focused on facility culture, staff-youth relationships, quality of life, quality of programming, and it kept us true to our mission for the past 23 years. The pictures here on the screen are of our National Kids Got Talent contest, one initiative we've had to promote our vision that has engaged kids from across the country who are incarcerated. The winner performs at our National Awards Night in August. I'm going to share with you our data, and I just want to tell you a little bit about it. It's qualitative, it's quantitative. In 1995, when we started, you know, there was no internet, and the whole field sort of looked at data as something that was going to, probably meant they were going to be sued. Now we're in this data-driven decision-making and continuous quality improvement time, and everyone knows it's essential to any agency or organization. But so as I share the data, remember where we've come from and how far we've come. And here's how we do it. We have a cycle of activities. The participants are all voluntary across the country, and they collect a lot of data. It goes into the website, and they look at reports, and they use it. We started this basically following the No Child Left Behind education approach that was more important to continually monitor things and have a growth model versus say you achieve, you know, a certain number and then you have met a standard. But it's always continuously improving and always working to make things better. We have some wonderful technology thanks to our team here in the office. A lot of information goes in. There's a magic wizard behind the screen, and it comes out in reports. The other thing we know about helping anybody use information to change is that you have to make it friendly, you have to make it easy to read, you have to make it meaningful. There you go. It's a lot. So you can see our domains there. There is not one called education. And at the time, and still, education is part of what we call programming, because it was felt in order to have a holistic approach to what goes on in facilities. Education, recreation, vocational education, and programming. The little bit of research that was available said, whatever you do, you have to keep kids busy. So I'm going to share with you outcome measures just so you see that over time. We give participants bar graph reports, and you see the bars say how they've done a particular piece of data over time. And then the red dot going across is the field average, which is just the average of all the participants at that time. And as Jacob was saying, you know, it's really hard to know the quality of services, and you know, going beyond just whether or not checks yes or no you have a GED. Well, we'll show you how we went and tried to go a little farther than that. And the data comes from, am I clicking? Okay, there you go, you can go to the next one. Just so you know what I'm about to show, those are some fun graphs. Comes from incident reports and facilities, youth surveys, staff surveys, family surveys, youth records, and exit surveys. So it's a lot of data. We have about 213 active facilities. We've had over 460 facilities participate since the beginning, and this is coming from 36 different states. And our youths are pretty close to what the Census of Juveniles and Residential Placement looks like. We have, I would say, a little bit, our youths are a little more white than in the facilities across the country, but it's pretty similar, as you can see from the demographics. Okay, drum roll, we're ready for some outcome measures. That was your quick tutorial on how to understand what the outcomes are. I'm going to share with you what we know about both correction facilities, the education there, as well as community-based. PBS works in correction, detention, assessment, as well as community residential programs. And our newest project that Peter mentioned is developing this sort of model for reentry. So in 1995, remember, education was part of programming, right? We looked at keeping them busy, you know, making sure they were getting some academic and vocational education. And in looking at reentry, it was really more about connections to services. Back then, it wasn't as difficult, I think, to get kids back into school as it is right now. And in 2018, thanks to a lot of the adolescent development research and a lot of work we've been doing on these new reentry standards, we know for sure that the high school diploma and GED is linked to preventing reoffending. We also know that the college path is not for everybody, and education really needs to expand beyond academic and vocational type of prep to social skills that are needed to obtain and sustain employment, right? Employability skills is what we're trying to figure out, and everyone's trying to make sure that those services are provided, and we're trying to measure it. And then I think that there are specific things that the system now is really clear that it needs to help transition, sort of information, enrollment, and credits, and of course all the documentations of how kids work. All right, so we're going to show you our reading and math scores. And this is sort of an example of how it works. So when we were looking at measuring education, as Angus was alluding to, it's really hard to tell. So we came up with some pretty simple outcome measures. Did the kids' math or reading scores improve? So what we're looking at is the kids, the difference in their test scores when they first enter a facility and when they leave. And you can see we've held pretty steady over the past 5 years. It's not quite over 50%. Some of that is because this data is looking at all kids. So in 1995, there was a younger population, so there were fewer kids who this didn't apply to. And we work with our states and facilities to put that into perspective. But we felt like this was a very pure measure of education. It's not the number of classroom hours or the teacher's qualifications, but really did kids leave with better skills when they were released. And that's a lot of the approach that we're taking with the reentry standards. Sort of the end goal is what is the kid taking with him or her when they're leaving. And so you can see it really hasn't changed a whole lot, and it's a little bit of a plateau, but that could be in part because of the increasing age of kids. But so if you are a PBS participant and you're taking a look at this and you might say, oh, you know, my kid's math scores dropped, what you could do is you could dig a little deeper into it, and this is where I think it can get interesting. You can look at your math and reading scores by race and ethnicity, and when they do that, you can see on this chart, or I hope you can see on the chart, that over to the right, it's the Black non-Hispanic kids whose scores, the fewest whose scores were able to improve. So, for example, there's a facility that we're working with that was concerned that the math scores were going down. They took a look and they did see that it was the minority kids, and then they dug even deeper and found that, in fact, those were the same kids who were removed from school more frequently and placed in confinement more frequently. So you can see, at least I hope you can see, how looking at this kind of data can really help change services and also I think help assess what's going on. And the ultimate purpose of all this is to improve the kids' lives. We can look at the same thing by reading, and it is slightly different. You can see here pretty much all groups, fewer kids improved over time. The 3 or 4 different demographic categories on the bottom have really small sample sizes. But it's an interesting way to take a look at it. All right. So in addition to some of this administrative or quantitative data, we ask kids a lot of questions, and we can get a nice picture of what's going on by asking kids, by asking staff, and of course by asking families. So pretty much what we found here is most of the kids said school was helpful or very helpful, right? Just about 2/3 across the past 5 years. Most also said the programming, remember school is part of programming the way we have this, is helping them to understand what they need to do when they go home, right? And getting a little bit ready for reentry. And they also, most said that they will be attending school in the community, that contact has been looking at the records. The contact has been made with the school, slightly less, and that the percent of kids whose special education is needed. So it's a lot, I think what we all know, and then Jacob alluded to as well, is that the connection, right, if they're going to go from the facility into community school, it's a struggle, as there is most parts of reentry. And lastly, when we're looking at the kids in the correction facilities, this is definitely one of my favorite questions. So what is the best thing the facility did to get you ready to move to your next placement or go home? And you can see some of a good 50%, and they can answer as many, check as many of these responses as they want. But half of them said, you know, it was because they got help in their education or their GED. You can see slightly more talked about job skills, life skills, improved attitude, and accountability for my actions. And make better choices. That's hats off to all you directors and everybody who works in the facility out there. Okay, I'm going to shift a little bit and tell you what we know about kids who are in the community residential programs, which is pretty simple, or most of them, just about everybody was attending an educational program, right? And so these are community residential programs, but 81% of them were doing them on site. 78% higher than the kids in facilities showed improved math scores, and 71% showed improved reading scores. And most were going to continue their education after discharge. You can see, or what our belief is that obviously being closer to the community, there is more connection with the schools, and it's a little easier. And certainly the programs that we visited as part of the reentry work bore out the same kind of information. Talking about sort of vocational and career pathways in the community programs, not many participated in a program, but the ones who did got some sort of documentation that they had finished a program or a certificate. Whereas in the correction facility, most kids completed some sort of curriculum, and 93% of the youth reported that they had been on at least one successful work release day. So these are some of the different ways we've been trying to help facilities look at education and reentry data, and basically how do you make the connection for kids. I'm going to switch now. So on our quest, of course, to keep relying on data to help make change, not only make change, but sustain change. OJJDP, following the release of a lot of the adolescent development research, the National Academies of Sciences report and the implementation guide, decided with all the emphasis and all the money that was going out from so many agencies for reentry program services, whether it's jobs, housing, education, that they really needed to find out what worked. I think Joseph said, you know, what we want to do is find out what works and scale it up. Well, that's pretty much, I think, what OJJDP is looking for in this grant, is a way to measure, assess what's going on in reentry programs and services, so we can find out what works and we can have some research and evaluation done. And it's really given us a chance. So remember, there we were 23, 24 years ago, there was no internet and there was some pretty basic understanding of kids' education in facilities and moving them out. So it's been great to think about how we can better incorporate sort of the adolescent development research and the brain science into some standards and outcome measures. So this is a quick look at how we are approaching it. Like everything in juvenile justice, it's a big ball of wax that we're doing, but we're putting this sort of theory of change to test that if an agency or a facility adheres to the principles of accountability, fairness, family, and cross-systems collaboration, and they implement practices like assessment, reentry planning, case management, quality, and implementation, we will get these positive youth outcomes. And what we're focused on are 3 domain areas for the positive youth outcomes: education and employment being the first, well-being and health being the second, and community connection and contribution being the third. And they're all very linked, as you can imagine. But education and employment, the first year of this grant, we were fortunate enough that OJJDP gave funding for literature review to be done in education, employment, well-being, and health. All these showed up in some form as really helping kids or help reducing reoffending. So I'll share with you right now where we are in this education and employment domain. What we do and have done is always set a goal. This is where I'm saying it's a growth model, but way different than education and keeping kids busy. We've now learned that really the goal is to develop a long-term employment or career pathway. My career pathway is out there in some of the places we've visited that does a really nice job, I think, of braid together education and employment. And we have 6 standards that we're testing right now around the country. And you can see that they're written, I would say, with enough flexibility to be adopted, not only in correction and community residential programs, but also in the different points of transition as kids go out. So a clear plan, and we have found many places that do have a good career plan and consistency in terms of kids' goals for both work and education. That they complete their academic goals. We were very mindful of the fact that the goals are radically different. You know, just to get a high school diploma is not really probably a goal. That might be a goal a little bit further down the line for some kids, but to complete their academic goals, and same with their vocational skill goals. And this is also trying to make sure that kids' input and kids' voice is in there, that they help set their goals, and then they can achieve them, which of course helps them have hope, right? If you can set a goal and actually achieve it, then you get a taste of hope, which they might have not had otherwise. Mastering employability and social skills has been a really interesting journey. I would ask anyone who has, we have a couple of employability or employment curriculums that we've been gathering, but please feel free to send anything along that you think would help inform this work. It's reentry@pbstandards.org. There are a couple places that also actually do pre and post testing after kids have had different employability skills. So I think that it's something we can really move ahead. All of this work is designed. When we did the first project starting 20 years ago, a lot of the things that we asked for, no one thought were feasible. But we felt like the purpose of a project like this is to really be forward thinking. So while if some of these sound a little daunting, in another long time, 20 years, I think it will hopefully be the standard way everybody does business. And then, of course, making sure that they have the documents that they need to support. That's, become even more critical. The driver's license, social security card, transportation. And I think some other research has really made it really clear that we also have to make sure that they can pay their rent and afford their living expenses. And we just did a great program that did a really good job, but a kid had to work until he had earned $3,000 or at least 3 months rent. And they were doing that. They weren't keeping kids longer, but they really just sort of pushed this thing that you have to be able to survive. And then connected to meaningful employment. There are some folk out there that do a good job of understanding not only the number of kids who have jobs, but like what's the average salary and how long do they stay employed. We heard a lot that a kid can leave a program or facility and get a job, but it's very hard to sustain the job. And the programs that seemed to work were the ones that had some adult or some connection, maybe a mentor or something who really helped them. And also helped work with the employer. So if something happened and the kid didn't show up the next day, the employers were not going to just throw him out. So I have one last slide. I'll just share with you a couple of things. I'm sure that you all know most of them, but the struggles and strategies that we've seen out there are great programs where, they can get kids engaged while they're in. This was from a facility. And the kids are all ready to go. It was a farming and landscaping type thing. But, then the kid would be released at 16, and by the time he was 18, there was no guarantee that he would be available or the job would be available. There were some wonderful programs that would give kids, a certification in something, say welding, but there wasn't a welding job to be had, within 100 miles. So it's just, how do you match what is available locally as well as what you can provide. And of course, there's a stigma. There are employers that are welcoming to kids or anybody who's been in trouble with the justice system, and then there are some who are not. But I needed to end with a couple of really good things, and there are a couple that fell off my slide. What a lot of places have done, there's been a lot of creativity done out there with these struggles, right? You don't have the right jobs, you don't have the right certification. UTech and Lowell Math, which I know Peter knows really well, is just an example of an awesome social enterprise. They recycle they deconstruct and recycle mattresses all over New England, and the kids get great work experience. And the picture up there, which is really doesn't do it justice, one of their most recent programs is they've been taking old discarded wood and turning them into cutting boards that are now prominently sold in Whole Foods Market, which is a big chain out here in New England. It's just creativity. You know what's available in terms of kids' needs, resources, and businesses. And there's an awesome foundation that I first heard about when we were out in Utah, and it's called One Heart. And really, it's just a local business organization adopts a kid. They give 10 hours a week of job training. They also include social emotional learning. They serve as a mentor. And they also involve parents in 2 hours of social emotional learning a week. So this is the type of thing I think that there might be businesses and other organizations out there that really help. And the work the kids do is meaningful: carpentry, construction, landscaping. I think they're connected to home builders in a way. There is a program, SOAR, that is in Sacramento County, California. And what this is a program for kids who already have their high school diploma or high set. And it's just to get them, those who are interested, connected to college professors and they do it. They meet just like they're going to college and connect them to jobs. And I had one, oh, and then there's one other thing I know that we've seen help is PBS gives grants to kids who are working, a matching grant while kids are in a facility. And it's been fun to see kids who are doing all sorts of different jobs, leaving the facility sometimes and sometimes not. And they can save up a little money over the summer and leave with something in their pocket. So, whew. I guess I'm passing it back to Simone. Simone, are you there? I know you've had some technical difficulty.
I made it in, Pam.
Yay, thank you, Simone.
Yeah, thanks to Jonah.
Thank you, Jonah.
I want to thank him and Jacob for the presentation today and sharing information about both of their organizations. And we really do appreciate you taking the time to do that. We do have a few questions, so I'll try to direct them in one way or the other, but please, Jonah, Jacob and Kim, please just jump in and answer the question together. So the first one is, we still hear from so many jurisdictions that community schools are not allowing youth to enroll or re-enroll if they have been suspended or expelled prior to their incarceration in a secure setting. And other schools, once of learning of the suspension from their previous school, do not allow them in. Do you know of any locations that have addressed this barrier pretty well for kids who have, in fact, been suspended or expelled prior to their incarceration? And if so, what does that look like?
Well, this is Kim. I can only say no. I haven't really seen, except for they create an alternative school. So I think that is a problem where you sort of get shut out of one and difficulty spreads. But I don't know, Jacob, if you've seen something else. Sorry.
In general, alternative schools tend to be the most common example to handle that issue. And something that some states have done, what we've seen is passing legislation that sort of limits when schools can and cannot actually reject a student returning to their school. So they've taken some efforts to try to limit the amount that happens and the extent to which that happens. And that's really been a more effective strategy that we've seen than anything around establishing alternative schools to serve these youth.
Okay, thanks. Appreciate that. There's two questions pertaining to the survey, Kim, that you were discussing earlier. So the first question is, what is the name of the survey that was done with students, and is this exit interview available for public use?
Well, the name of the survey is just called the PBS Climate Survey. And our exit interview, no, it's not available for public use, but if you send us an email, we use a lot of questions that are have been out and tested by other surveys, for example, the syrup on the census. And if there's a particular area or something that you're struggling with, we'd be happy to share.
Thanks, appreciate that. Another question is, can you provide examples of curriculum that have been effective for teaching employability or social skills?
You know what, we'll have to do that in follow-up, only because we've been collecting them from our field test visits over the past 3 or 4 months, and I did not have a chance to pull the few together. I don't believe that, and I think they're mostly what I'm going to call homegrown, but let me put together a list, and then I'll give it to wherever you can post it and share it. I think that'd be an incredibly helpful resource for everybody.
Absolutely.
Sorry, I just haven't written it down.
And just to jump in, I think obviously that list is incredibly valuable and helpful. But on top of that, one of the things that obviously is a struggle in terms of reentry is that facilities are not normal environments, and it's incredibly difficult to recreate. So finding, soft skills curriculum that could help teach that is difficult, and it's difficult to implement effectively, and taking advantage of policies that may allow youth to work outside the facility in jobs even while under supervision can be really effective in helping to mitigate and alleviate some of those concerns. And we also haven't seen it, but are interested in tracking, know that Southern New Hampshire University is working with Google and has a grant from Google to develop an online soft skills curriculum that they are, I think, currently piloting. And that if that does show promise and is successful, it can be a really strong tool for those facilities that are in more rural areas and maybe don't have connections to as many local community organizations that they can partner with. So just something to keep an eye on as well.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jacob and Ken, we appreciate that. So Jacob, this is a question for you in reference to the survey results for private facilities. Were these locked facilities only, or do they also include non-secure residential sort of treatment programs?
In general, I think these were locked facilities. You know, when conducting these surveys, obviously different states have slightly different structures to them, and so to some extent, states are able to define as necessary to match the structure that they are reporting on. In general, we were looking for those secure facility responses. That was the vast majority. But you know, a state could have chosen to identify a non-secure residential facility as something that they felt met the definition under their structure and reported it in that way. So I can't promise 100% that it was only those secure locked facilities, but that was the vast majority.
All right, great. Thank you. One caller has asked for you to repeat the email address to send the programming. We're currently providing in programs in development. They say that we are a nonprofit that operates in a facility to provide these services, vocational connections, training, and employability, and soft skills. So could you repeat that email address?
Reentry@pbstandards.org. Thank you. That would be awesome. And we will send you a follow-up email as well.
Thank you, Kim.
Great.
Is there a particular career assessment tool that you recommend? Or maybe a better question would be, do you have a resource that would look at career assessment tools that potentially the person asking the question might be able to review?
Well, I'll answer, and it's going to be a little similar to the previous one, is that I have a stack of different assessments that we've collected from our travels with this reentry grant project, and I think every single one of them was developed by an individual program or service, but we'll be happy to put any of that together. So no, I can't myself recommend one. I think what people know are the basic components that need to go into it, right? You have to make sure the kids' input is into it, and it's this. What we've heard most is this wonderful balance of, yes, I know you want to be a rapper, but in the long term, you have to be thinking about some other things as well. And some staff have, I think, very creatively, probably less through assessment and more through relationship, helped guide them to understand really what they want to do in the long run. But we'd love to hear of any that are out there.
Thanks, Kim. Appreciate that. We have maybe one or two more questions we can ask. This question is, we know that educational reentry is part academic and part social emotional in nature. Would you want to share any concrete suggestions on how to assist youth make this adjustment, you know, leaving from the secure setting on that first day, that second day, that first week of school, that is so critically important for them? The best practices, maybe? Well,
I can tell you what I heard recently, that is close to this. There's a reentry unit that does work out at Sacramento County Detention Center, and they have several liaisons that help kids move back, the committed kids back into the community. And what it sounds like is not only do they have someone at the school who does all the schoolwork and I believe is there sometimes and make sure that the first few days are well, but they also have a community liaison who calls the kid. I mean, it's surrounding the kid with support services and just checking in. I think it's mostly what I've heard, but that's such a critical time. The question is really very good.
I think I would echo similar sentiment that it's a good question because it's incredibly difficult. And it's obviously an incredibly difficult time for a lot of reasons. And one thing that we've seen be somewhat successful is having a really strong educational advocacy program. So having people who work with the schools to make sure that the schools understand, what it entails, the student needs are, to advocate on behalf of the student rights, to make sure that those students aren't being discriminated against or not being kicked out of class or being, violated for not attending school in the proper way or meeting school's rules, and really having those educational advocacy departments built into part of what they're doing to support the youth during reentry.
I'll just throw in one other little thing that we thought was wonderful in this program in Sacramento. They also made sure that they got the kid their own school ID. So the kid was school had his own school ID.
Kim, I'll add, this is Simon, I'll add to that. A couple of successful programs beyond, having that educational advocate and that transition coordinator is if there is any way to allow the kid to have a day pass, a couple of weeks or 10 days before the child is actually scheduled released, to actually go to the school, get that ID, get their schedule, potentially be introduced to a couple of key staff members who are there saying, hey, look, we're the caring adults here at the school who want to make this reentry and this education transition successful for you. And of course, this is something that probation could be potentially involved in, as well as the staff at the facility. And, this is where, like you said, they can get the ID, and that way they'll walk into school the first day, have their schedule in hand, have their ID, they know who the homeroom teacher is, and they know where that room is. So I think all that prep work that's done, right before the youngster leaves, especially that connecting them to the school in that way is pretty important. That's something we've seen in a couple of places that they've said have been very successful. Okay, so we are down to the last 30 seconds. We want to once again thank Jacob and Kim and their organizations for, number one, the work that they do to continue to promote good outcomes for kids in the juvenile justice system, and especially around education. And I'll turn things over to Peter or Mike, who might have some closing words and prepare you for the upcoming calls.
Well, I'll jump in real quick. Just the next meeting is Monday, August 6th at 4 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. And we're going to be doing post-secondary opportunities. The other thing that I would say is, as you exit, if you could possibly help fill out the survey, we would very much appreciate that. We're really working off the feedback. So that would be really helpful. And I also want to thank Kim and Jacob for joining us and taking the time to go through this. It was very helpful, very relevant, and very helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Great job. And thanks to all the participants for taking time out of your day to be on the call with us. Very much appreciated. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good job.